Welcome to Belief Busters Podcast, where we change the world one belief at a time. And we're dedicating this series to changing the world by looking at what are our beliefs around racism, systemic racism, and I want to give you a voice to the conversation. And so I invite you to the discussion. I'm glad you could be with us on this journey of discovery and awakening. Welcome to another episode of Belief Busters, where we continue to look at the beliefs that we have that may be impeding us in our lives, in how we relate to each other. And I'm really excited for this series because we're looking at race relations. What beliefs do we hold about others? What beliefs can we shift? How are we indoctrinated into believing what we believe as fact, as truth? And today I'm really happy to have Reverend Daniel Beckett to be on this podcast. He's a classmate of mine in seminary. I love his mind. He's has these juicy insights, and we've had some really in-depth conversations, and he's unafraid to tackle what's in the room. And I've always respected him for that. So Daniel, I welcome you to our podcast, and just tell us a little bit about where you are and what you're doing right now.
Sure, and thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted to be in this conversation with you. I am the minister at Unity of Augusta Church in Augusta, Georgia. In the COVID era, that's online now, like many of us. But I'm in my fourth year there, so I know the community well and really love and appreciate that church and that community. As you said, we had met in seminary, which we graduate in 2016, so I'm still sort of fresh out of it. I know that this beard doesn't make me look young, but I've come to all things church and spirituality relatively late in life. Delighted to be here, though. You know, we get a call, we answer a call, we show up and see what happens. Not unlike the invitation to be on this podcast itself. I literally got a call, I answered the call, and I'm showing up for whatever it is that presents and whatever it is that needs to be discussed.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that. One of the things that, you said you're in Augusta, Georgia. And so one of the things that comes to mind immediately, and this may be a false belief or maybe a myth, it may be one of those things that I was taught growing up, like Georgia is the heart of racism. It's just one of the places. It's like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. It's like, don't go there. And I'm a Northeast girl, right? So I'm Long Island, and it's like, oh, we don't go there. So tell me a little bit about your community and that area. Am I incorrect in my assumptions?
Well, I could not characterize the area. I didn't grow up in that area, and I actually live still in the deep South, but in Columbia, South Carolina. I should have mentioned that. I'm about an hour away from Augusta, Georgia. But those states that you mentioned are kind of like, they're southern states, and it can be a broader list, but then there's deep South, and it does include Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, usually South Carolina, maybe not North Carolina, I don't know. But one thing that I've learned on this journey is I have a limited perspective on things. And so I always try to keep that in mind. And I've learned to be very careful about making broad generalizations about things that I don't have direct personal experience with. And so this would be one of them. So it may be that the places that I am now, South Carolina and Georgia, it may be that racism is a much hotter issue there, and it may also be that I do not see it because I'm in a bubble of my own life, like so many of us are. And as you and I have talked about before, and I do remember it was 2015, I think. You and I were in class and had a wonderful talk about sort of this systemic, the way that systemic racism can show up even on news stories that have no intention of overtly being such, but once you see it, man, you can't unsee it. And you had given me a journal article that turns out to have been from Robin DiAngelo. The article was titled White Fragility. It was 3 years before her book actually came out. And so that was super helpful, because then I could put a name on this thing and this thing that we were seeing in our class. And the responses that some of the responses we heard as, I shared my dismay with what we had just watched. It was like a microcosm for the white. You get the white perspective and the POC perspective, and you see them clashing right there in front of my face. So that was a really good eye-opening experience for me. So I don't know if the area that I am in is more or less, quote, racist than any other. I tend to think about racism in terms of systemic issue, not like race-based bias, which is relatively superficial and can get mistaken for systemic racism. That is, if you look like me, if you're white like I am, it is genuinely very hard to see, and you have to want to see it in order to see it at all. And if you don't want to see it, that's easy. It's so easy just to avoid this whole issue. And you can find a whole group of people that will gladly and loudly support you in not seeing this.
Yeah. So you brought up two really interesting facts. One is the systemic racism and the unconscious biases, I think. Is that how you phrased it?
Racial bias.
The racial bias. So tell me how you see the difference between those two.
For me, racial bias is just a general term. Anyone can experience racial bias on either side of it.
Absolutely.
There might be a person that says, "Oh, I don't want to eat at this restaurant. There are too many black folks in there." Okay, so that's sort of a superficial thing. And there might be a black person that says the same thing. "I'm not going in there. There's too many white folks in there." Okay, that's not systemic racism. That's a relatively superficial judgment. Now, it might belie systemic racism, and certainly if it's a white person who's expressing that, it no doubt does. But racial bias is just, I don't want to say it's innocuous, but it's not the problem, right? The problem is not the superficial stuff. The problem is the racism that's woven deeply into our culture all the way back to the beginning. That's very troubling and difficult to unwind, and it touches some very deep issues, and there is rage and violence underneath it, and it is a very sticky and tricky subject. So I try to always bear in mind, is this sort of a superficial level thing that anyone can experience? You hear this term reverse racism. Maybe there's racial bias that flows both ways, but that's not the problem, right? The problem is the systemic thing. There is no reverse systemic racism. That's a one-way flow. So that's how I try to think of these things, sort of to keep them straight in my mind. It's not unlike, there's this word judgment, right? And we have even one of the Unity 12 powers around it. And do you mean, I always clarify, do I mean discernment or do I mean condemnation? Because that word can go either way. And in fact, I almost don't like to use the word judgment because it's unclear. Am I talking about discernment or am I talking about condemnation? And I find the same thing true about racism, or the word racist even. I don't find it helpful, because what I'm seeing is people running around trying to identify the racists, who are the real racists, and that becomes a distraction from what's really going on. I'm saying, well, just forget about who is and isn't a racist. Let's just all acknowledge, I can acknowledge I'm a racist. That's easy. Why? Because I grew up in this society where it's woven into absolutely everything. There is no way that I'm not, and my task, if you will, my job is to see as much of that as possible. Just
Right.
like, beginning with that article you gave me.
Right. So what I really try to get across to our listeners is that if we are raised in a Western culture, if we are raised in the US of A, we are going to have biases.
Absolutely.
It's how we're trained.
Yeah.
It's part of the education system. It's part of our cultural system. It's part of our family systems. So we have biases. We are taught to see races. That's part of our DNA in growing up in this culture. And I think that's really what you were just talking about, that when you look at it from, I don't want to be around other white people, or I don't want to be around other Black people, or whatever that is indoctrinated beliefs culturally. So I get that, right? And so we don't really have to use, and I'm going to use the word judgment on ourselves or each other, right? Which is, and I'm using it in the way of condemnation.
Right. Yeah.
Somebody's a racist. We all are, to one form or another.
Yeah.
And what I love about this conversation with you is, okay, so if we stop the whole pointing fingers at each other with labels, and now move to, what is this whole systemic racism? What is that about? How is this impacting lives? Why do we even want to know about it? Now, this is the juicy conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I found it. I mentioned that question, who's a racist, trying to decide who to hang that label on is a distraction from the actual issues, which is the systemic, the deep running parts of it that are, if you're white, very hard, if not almost impossible to see. And if you don't want to see them, you won't, and you don't have to, right? That's a statement of white privilege, plain and clear. But if you can't see it, then it doesn't make any sense. It's like trying to explain to the fish, I could see the evangelist fish going up to the other one, wants to talk to him about the water. What water? What's water?
Right.
It's around you. It's in you. It's everything. We're in it right now. What? You're nuts. I don't even know what you're talking about.
My question to you is, why would someone of privilege want to even become aware of systemic racism? Why have that conversation
That
with
is a
someone
great question. I don't know. I've never thought about that, but let me do my best to answer it. I can't characterize broadly because I don't know what other people are doing, so I can only answer from my own experience. But part of where I am in my life, I'd mentioned coming late to church, to the whole church or spiritual way of being, and that is a path of continual unfoldment, right? Growth and shifts of consciousness, which very much means seeing things differently, seeing with new eyes, seeing things that were there but had not been seen before. We have this saying, even I saw the light, I woke up, I'm saved, or whatever. That concept of the light coming on, and God as light is a very strong image, and it's right there in the beginning of Genesis 1. And so the light comes on, and I have a choice. I'm not choosing, I don't feel that I'm choosing whether to see something or not, but I am choosing how to respond to what I'm seeing. And I just quite simply can't pretend it's not there. Maybe just because of the path I've chosen. I've answered a divine call that I don't understand, and that is an unfolding thing, day by day, moment by moment. What does that mean? Is sort of a question that's always open in my mind. Well, one thing that I'm very sure that it means is not pretending that I can't see things that I'm seeing. And so you can't unring the bell. Once I see it, I can't unsee it. And so it's a matter of, well, what do I do? Given that it's there, and I'm not going to pretend it's not there.
Great. And how do you have those conversations with other people of privilege? Is it an easy conversation? Do you find it difficult? Do you find people open to having the conversation with you?
I know many people who are, and I can just make a casual reference to it, and we're on the same page, and we can have it be just a part of an ongoing conversation and relationship, and we can share stories of our dismay at what we see in the world or what's going on with other folks, and then on the other side of it all, people, it seems that people can't or don't see. And to me, the litmus issue, just have something to grab a hold of, is white privilege. Do I or do I not see white privilege? I mean, and I don't mean just like a little bit of it, but that's an entry point
Yes.
into the whole broader issue. And people who don't see it, the stuff we're talking about doesn't make any sense, right? And we look nuts. But I have a lot of friends who do see it, and we don't have to define terms and walk on eggshells and all that. We just can very matter-of-factly weave it into whatever is going on. Something happening in the news, and we can say, man, there it is again. What do you think of that?
I love what you said about it's a divine call about awakening, right? And that
Absolutely.
once you see it, you can't put the covers back over your head and say it doesn't exist. And so part of what I feel the calling is to be able to say what we see and then ask, how do we change that? How do we make it better? Um, how do we call each other up to a higher level of being, right? So
Yes.
one of the callbacks that I hear an awful lot when Black Lives Matter comes up is, well, all lives matter,
Mm.
you know. And from that perspective, as a minister, I get that, yes, all life matters. We're all of God. And the call is to notice that people who are minorities, people of color, are not being treated as if they have value, as if they matter, as if they are of God. And so that's really what the call is. And then how do we make a difference in that? And so my question to you is, how do we invite people who are of privilege to look at this issue and to honor the divine in people of color? How do we really walk our talk now? How do we do that? And I'm open to suggestions.
Oh man, me too. Because if you know the answer, please lay it on me. I could use it, because I can't see something for someone else, right? I can share my experience of things, and it will land how it lands with them. I can do what, from where I sit, feels like opening doors of new ways of seeing or new possibilities, but I can't walk through that door for anybody else. And so it seems to me, and I'm new to this, I am no expert in this, but it seems to me that based on my own life experience and things I've been through, that raising awareness is always step one. I can't address anything if I'm not aware of it, if I'm not willing to see it. Once I'm aware of it, then I can engage it, maybe even fight with it or try to reject it or wrestle with it, but at least I'm engaged, with whatever the issue is. So I really feel like, and because I have come to see our society in two main camps, you do or you do not see white privilege. If I can raise awareness somehow or other, then what happens beyond that is outside of my control, because I don't know what people are going to do with that. They might react badly to it and double down on refusing to see it. I have no idea, but I know that, and it's a central tenet of any kind of spiritual growth is that everything begins with awareness. Now, the second step is acceptance. Once I'm aware of it, acceptance, and I don't mean approval, I mean like acknowledging, yes, there it is. I'm not fighting with the fact that it's there anymore. So we go from awareness to acceptance, and then only from that point is any kind of growth available. But this is not, I don't see in any way this is the kind of thing where you can sort of approach someone and tell them how it is, which means telling them how they should be seeing it. Because if they don't, they don't. And you're picking a fight. If they already do, then, you know, kind of like I was saying with friends that do, it can just be part of the conversation, you know, part of the awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, you're right. We can't force anyone to see things the way that we see things. Everyone
Yeah.
comes with their own world views. But part of my commitment is, or I should say, and instead of but, right? And my commitment is to have the conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be willing to put myself in the mix of having the conversations with people of just my experience and how it's affected and impacted me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so from that, they either will see the light or not see the light. You know, that is that is theirs to do. But all I am is responsible for how I show up in the world and what's my commitment to self and commitment to walking the divine path. And so if I'm awakened to that there is systemic racism, then mine is to continue having the conversation with people across all walks of life of, so what is it? What does it look like? And how can I make an impact to shift it? You know, so I think that's part of why I'm doing the podcasting and having this series right now on race relations. And, you know, when I was in my 20s, I was really like angry and just, you know, of course you have to see it my way, which is so not helpful in having a conversation with someone. But what I'm finding out right now is that there is grace when I'm able to love the person in front of me, regardless of what they think about the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in that grace, there's miracles that can happen in that grace. But one of the things that I see from traveling across the country is that if I lived where these people lived, I would have the same beliefs that they
Yes.
have.
I think that's
You
really
know, so
important.
that really, yeah, that really frees me up to not be us versus them, but to say, I get why you think and feel that way. And now let's have a conversation about that with
Yeah.
no judgment, no anger, no, you know, you've got to change your mind. And it may not be something that shifts them, but it feels like there's just that little seed and that little pearl and that little grace that starts the journey for them.
You know, what's coming to mind is you are talking about what I've come to understand as creative non-resistance, I would call it. That's a phrase I picked up from Eric Butterworth book, In the Flow of Life. He talks about creative non-resistance because I can't be in that place of grace that you're talking about if I'm fighting with someone, right? I need to find a way to get to a place where I'm not butting heads, even in my head, you know, quietly. I don't mean even overtly, but in my own consciousness, where I'm not making someone less than, I'm not fighting, I'm not resisting, right? Which to my ear is one of Jesus' central teachings, creative
Yeah.
non-resistance, because only then can I have that experience that you described so well of just being willing to show up. And you also said something I think is right at the center of all this. If I had all the same life experiences as another person had, I would see the way they saw, right? They're not bad person. We've just had different life experiences. And so we have literally see a different world. We each sort of create our own world in consciousness based on everything that we experience and the meaning that we make from it. And yes, we're seeing a really deep divide in a couple major camps. And if I had grown up and had all the experiences, then I would see it the same way.
Dan, is there anything else that you want to say to our listeners before we end our conversation?
All I can think is just, keep showing up. We say suit up and show up. Keep showing up. And I'm talking to myself as I say all this, keep being willing to become aware and have that awareness shift to acceptance, and have that acceptance shift to answering a call for moving ahead. And as we say, in the way that brings the best and the highest for all involved. And I cannot pretend to know what that is, but I'm always trying to be open to it and see it in my own life, and hopefully, by example, perhaps that might help somebody else.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate having this juicy conversation with you, and I see us connecting again in the future around this. So, and some other stuff too.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of belief systems. I hope this gives you permission to change your beliefs and subsequently the world. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast and leave a review wherever you listen. You can reach me at info@preachitsister.com. I've also written a book, Turning Your Why into Why Not, that gives you practical resources and steps that you can take to continue on the journey of exploring what your belief systems are. I look forward to seeing you next time on Belief Busters Podcast. See you on the flip side.